Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Dr. Robert Allen Black. He is an international creativity advocate and the creator of the Spreading Creative Framework. So, Dr. Black, it's wonderful having you here today.
Thank you, Nick. I've been watching some of yours and reading a variety of the great amount of things that you share, which I applaud you on that.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. Absolutely. So for people who don't know about you or the work that you've done, could you just give us a very brief background as to how you got started in the field of creativity?
Okay. In 1960, as a 16-year-old, I started doing freelance cartooning and graphic artwork. A little bit here, a little bit there, kind of thing. But then, instead of doing what I really wanted to do, and that was be a cartoonist or fantasizing about going to work with Walt Disney's corporation, I thought my parents would never send me to school for cartooning, so I chose architecture, which I had a beginning love of at the time. So I studied architecture. While there, I learned many things. I got out. I worked as an architect for a variety of firms for different reasons, left a world famous architect by the name of Gunnar Burkertz, which some of my friends retired there before Gunnar died. I kept in touch with Gunnar through the internet, thanks to the internet for a while. But I left to go look for a job in advertising. After several weeks, I ended up with a job as a graphics and signage designer for a large architect. I almost got out of the field. Time passes, I do a variety of things. I get back into architecture, but one day my first wife and I got a letter saying that our oldest son qualified for gifted education. That fascinated me. I thought it was interesting, so I started exploring it. I tended to be a guest speaker at the elementary school where my sons went quite often, so they knew me. They were comfortable with me being on campus. This was back when the fear of strangers on campus was just becoming a fear, where now it's like the police are there if anyone walks on campus. And I kept asking, what can we do at home? What can we do at home? And I tried to be as active as I could as a parent and a busy, devoted architect and designer, scout leader, soccer coach, even though the kids all knew more about soccer than I did, or international football, to be more accurate. But then one day at a parent-teacher meeting, principal asked me, or said, I have 23 students, I have a classroom, and I have a small budget. Do you have any time? I laughed at her at the time. I said, I'm working 6 days a week to get paid for 3. This is in the mid-70s when we had double-digit inflation, when prices on things in stores were going up daily, not monthly or weekly. But there was something about it bugged me for the next few days. So I went in on Monday to the partners of the architectural firm, who were also my partners in the graphics firm. We switched roles because it worked at the time. And I said, I don't know where this is going to take me, but there's something about this I think I must do. And I want to give 1 day a week. And I won't go any more in detail, it's not necessary. So I did. Some of the greatest highs I ever had was working with those 23 kids while I started to learn how to teach and how people really learn. That led me to 2 articles by Paul Torrance. As you said, we want to talk a little bit about him. My guru, my mentor, my teacher, and the greatest gift, as I told you a moment ago. personal friend. I was with him just before he died. But the article said two things. Two articles said these. One, everyone is born creative. Two, creative thinking can be taught and learned as long as we are alive. The last research he did before his wife had her strokes and became childlike were studies at nursing homes and senior citizens demonstrating that teaching them creative thinking tools and techniques and processes helped them with dementia. I started a long trek that's now been 45 years, going through 3 degrees, finishing 2 of them, teaching at 3 different universities and speaking to over 4,000 audiences since 1976.
I always find it, yeah. I always
My
find it
devotion is
fascinating
creative
speaking
thinking.
with people. I always find it fascinating speaking with people who've been in an industry longer than I've been alive. So that's quite a run you've got there.
I think that'll do enough.
Okay. Now, you mentioned Professor Paul E Torrance, who, for anyone who's in the creativity research field, is obviously one of the most important figures, but a lot of people outside the field don't actually know who he is. So considering you studied with him, you worked with him, you considered him a friend, who was Professor Torrance and what was his impact on the field of creativity research?
Paul Torrance was a middle Georgian near Milledgeville, a small town. And if my hand was Georgia, somewhere here, where I live is here, Atlanta is here. And his father was a farmer. And one day, one of the many stories I've learned about him that are in some of the books about him were that his father basically took him aside and said, well, Paul, you need to become a teacher. You'll never survive as a farmer. He had various forms of dyslexia, especially 3 and 4 dimensional. He couldn't plow a straight line if his life depended on it. So he went into education. He taught at a military school. He taught at a high school. He then finally went on to get a doctorate. And one of the first projects he got to work on in the early 50s, thanks to another giant like himself, J.P. Guilford, who was president of the American Psychological Association in 1950, got him a grant. And what he was being paid to do was to research how to teach pilots to be ace pilots. It's like trying to teach the greatest footballer to be, the poorest footballer to be the greatest footballer. But what he learned in those couple of years while working on that grant was that one thing that the ace pilots all seemed to have, this obsession with being creative, different, and no matter what happened, they were going to survive. Not every pilot has that kind of drive or those guts to try anything. He started out with one of the first tests. Guilford had his own version, but they basically agreed on 4 primary things that they found in highly creative people. I stress the word highly creative. Was fluency. You ask a highly creative person or a divergently creative person, which they appear the same, they'll give you 100 answers. You say, what's 1 and 1? They won't give you 2. They'll give you 200. I've got a website page with 220 I collected in 24 hours with 12 associates around the world when the internet barely existed. The second one was flexible. They don't look at a ball. Well, I'll back up real quick, and if you want to edit it out, please do. One of the tests that was similar for Paul and for JP, I met him years later, but didn't really get to know him. He lived in a different state. But Paul's were circles, 30 circles on a blank sheet. JP's were squares. And the exercise is one of the first creative thinking tests that was accepted. And they both said, do something with these. And they gave them a time limit. That was it. Well, schizophrenics are great, fluent people. But you give them that round, the circle sheet, they'll draw 30 different balls. You get a highly creative or a divergently creative, if you want to explain the difference later, they'll draw 30 completely different things. And I thought about it, I bring you an example, because I supposedly have the highest score Paul ever got. But I knew the principle, I had degrees in it already when I filled it out. But highly creative people will draw in the circle, outside of the circle, different perspectives. They'll add titles, they'll put words, they'll combine, and many of the other things he discovered over the next 10 years using that test. And JP with the squares too. But the third one was to hitchhike. You say something, I say something, we put the two together. You say car, I say radio, we got a car radio. We say telephone and whatever 5,000 or 10,000 apps that can be used on this thing. This can do more than the computer as big as my house that my father worked on as an engineer in the 50s. This thing that I barely know how to use has more capability. The fourth one was originality. And Paul told me originally that he chose those because he could measure them. He could use probability and numbers in order to get the psychological community to accept his test. Everything he did was based on probability. And he tested creative thinking, not creativity. He challenged me one time when I was co-writing an article. I wrote the original draft, and then he was going to improve it or add things to it. But all he did, it was the first time he ever got mad out of 2 times in all the years I knew him. He got mad at me because he's an extremely humble man. Was, you wrote here, I've been teaching creativity. He says, you can't teach what you can't define. And I've never forgotten that point. And what he meant by that is there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of different definitions for the word creativity. Now, creative thinking, he used a basic definition that I've modified slightly, but most other researchers, like you've interviewed a few that I know, have just subtle differences. And mine is the generation or discovery of new ideas. That was Paul's. But my ad was new to you. They do not have to be new to your field, your profession, your occupation, your time, your culture, because I found over the years, it limits the amount of creative thinking people will do if they have to come up with something new that no one else has ever thought of. Because was this really an original idea? Did Steve and Steve really have an original, completely new idea? Or was it adaptations, additions, adding to? And one of the TV series that came out in the 70s, early 80s by James Burke, he was trying to prove everything can be traced back under the premise, nothing new under the sun. I'm sorry. Moses didn't have the design for this on the back of the tablet he left behind on the mountain. Mankind does create things with or without God or the universe's help.
Absolutely. And I think it then comes back to this research behind how creativity and creative thinking works. You mentioned that, according to you, there's a difference between highly creative people and divergently thinking people.
Okay.
What's the difference you see there?
All right. Now, thinking style, which has been around since I discovered, unfortunately, I didn't write my statements focused enough for my dissertation. And there's a chapter, number 3, you have to do, and that's a study of the literature. I had to trace back to Hippocrates to find the first Western concept of separating people into groups. And his are the four temperaments. I don't have them pulling out of my brain right now, but I could within 2 minutes find 1,000 articles I've got stored away. I had to trace back to through the I Ching over 8,000 years to find the yin yang, which unfortunately was brought to the United States in a bastardized form as one is male, one is female. No, it has nothing to do with gender. It has to do with how you think. So now I back up. There were left brain, right brain. That was popular back when I started. Roger Sperry and Joseph Bogan won the Nobel Peace Prize and many other things for their work. That kind of work had been done for, if not a millennium, at least several centuries, really. But no one really knew about it. We didn't have TV and internet to broadcast it. But they came out with this study based on 9 people suffering from a form of epilepsy. They changed the world of teaching and training. In principle, you're either left brain or you're right brain. I'm sorry, there's more to it than that. In fact, the universe is 4, 5, 6, 7 dimensions. If we really, so back to my point. Highly logical people often are as creative, but not as much. Highly intuitive or upper, what's called cerebral right brain. Some people use that term. I just use the word intuitive. They think in all directions. Those are, both of them can be highly, but divergently creative people will come up with 100 or 200. The challenge, the difference between those two alone, let alone the other two I'll mention in a moment, is the rational, logical, what I call meditative thinker finishes one project at a time. The highly divergent or intuitive is working on 5, 10, 20, 30 different projects. But the one nature, if they have any degree of success, if they promise something to someone else, whether they get paid or not, they will finish that. But rarely do they finish most of the rest of what they're working on. And the other two basic ways of thinking, one from the heart and the emotions, they prefer to do things together. And as long as their group is willing to do things differently, they will do differently. And then the last group, which can be highly creative too, but in a more subtle way, they don't like breaking rules. They don't like doing what hasn't. When you ask 1 and 1, they always say 2. The people-focused people will go, well, what do you think 2 ought to be? Or what do we think 2 ought to be now? And so forth. That's what I mean. It depends on your thinking style, your learning style, and so forth, which I base the foundation of almost everything I've done for 40 years on whether or not I'm matching me to you.
So let's take it through these 40 years now. You started off learning a lot from Professor Torrance, but I understand that your most recent work is actually more practical, going around companies and organizations, helping them understand what it takes to build up creative thinking skills. What's your insights on what it actually does take to either teach or learn or implement these different ways of thinking?
Okay. Creative thinking or creativity, sadly, comes and goes, the interest. It becomes a hot issue, it fades away. 15, 20 years ago, the word creativity scared everybody with an MBA because it was unpredictable. You just wrote an article that I read about the bridges, and you made reference to that fact of not being able to multitask. I'm sorry, highly intuitive people and some what I call negotiative, who are also intuitive in a more feeling way than a thought way, do multiple things. Do they always finish them? No. They're not like what I call the directives, the people who always there's a single answer, which is what K through 12 and sometimes all the way through PhD is how people graduate, is they give the professor back what they gave them. They regurgitate. And a famous case, my own father as an engineering student had a professor who gave a problem the same year, every year to the mechanical engineering students, and he was wrong. My father proved him wrong, but he had to back off if he wanted to get a grade. So he apologized, and the guy gave him a C or a B, the only C my father ever got. But there are many classic cases in engineering schools of that kind of thing. And one professor in Auburn, I believe it was, in Alabama, near where I live. And what he did, he had no textbook. Well, they created the textbook for the semester. And he loved to give the students the problems that were always wrong in the answer book, but they had to prove it. That was the challenge. That was my issue with my father. Whatever answer you come up with, be able to prove it.
So what does it take then to take these creative thinking skills and help individuals or organizations improve them?
Okay. Based on one of my independent studies, when I did my degree, I took the required courses, and then you're required to take so many electives. And I wasn't finding electives that really suited what I wanted to truly study. Well, Paul was so open, or we called him Dr. T out of love. It was so, because I only called him Paul between us. I never called him Paul in public out of respect to him. And I designed a course where I wanted to find out what the traits were of highly creative people. Once again, stressing the word highly, not just creative, because I already accept everyone is. And I'll come back to that one. So what I did was I said, okay, I have to be realistic. I've got 3 months. I went, all right, I'm going to start with J.P. Guilford's opening speech as president of the APA, where he challenged the psychological profession to study creative people, not sick people. Are you familiar with the DISC system, behavior-based? Okay, it's worldwide. There are hundreds of companies claiming to own it. No one really owns it anymore. They own their version. Copyright died many years ago. But Marston, who created the initial concept behind it, wrote a book, The Emotions of Normal People. This was back when Jung and Freud and all the people were studying sick people. And psychology was just taking off in the 20th century. But from that came this concept, we ought to be studying normal people to help normal people become better normal people, instead of always basing it on hospitalized people. Well, I went, okay, I'm going to start with 1950. I'm going to look through 1980. I chose 4 journals, 2 psychological and 2 educational journals. And I looked for articles. This is back in the dark ages of research, where you had to use card catalogs and Reader's Digest and so forth, and find the articles and read them. I ended up, instead of finding the magic 7, like Stephen Covey had with his 7 habits of highly effective people, or the magic 12 as Jesus had, and I'm not trying to be frivolous, I'm just trying to give rememberable images. I ended up with a 1/4 by 1/4 graph paper on the wall of our apartment, from the front door all the way to the window at the outer wall. 147 different researchers I read articles by, 460 some traits. I ended up depressed by that, burned out by it, which is a trait of highly right brain creative people. But then one day, one of the habits of highly right-brain people is they see patterns the rest of the people don't see. Not that they can't learn to see it, but we intuitively, we see it in our imagination. Highly feeling-focused people feel it. They walk into a room and they know whether the room is in a good mood or not. They know whether you're sick or not, even though you don't know you are. There's something about them in their intuitive nature. So one day as I was walking by this hideous chart with 400 and some traits, it dawned on me, look for a pattern. And I went, okay, I'm going to circle the ones that at least 5 of the 147 experts agreed on. And I came up with 32. Over the next few years, as I would use them as my crayon breaking traits, or trying to help people realize they are creative, but differently, I narrowed it down to all 32 can be taught. I added Paul Torrance's eventual 20 from his refined test over 30 some years to 52. And I started a newsletter where I shared how to develop one of these traits per week every year for the next 17 years, actually, through the internet, originally through Yahoo, until they, no comment, what they messed up their Yahoo groups, so to speak. So my premise is you can learn to be creative. You can learn to be flexible. You can learn to be more fluent. You can learn to be more curious. You can learn to be more future oriented. Now, some people, because of their personality or thinking traits, perhaps like you said at birth, you already can. The rest of it you may have to learn. And that's been my commitment for years, trying to do that. And what you're leading up to is my ultimate goal is to help teams, departments, offices or plants or entire organizations become more creative. And I have my system I call spreading that represents 6 categories of things we can do if we really want to raise the creativity in anyone or any group.
So let's go through this spread framework. I think people would be really interested as to what it stands for, and maybe just because we're coming up on time to the end of the interview, if you can focus on maybe one example from the framework about how people can use that to improve their creative thinking capabilities.
Since '78, when I attended my first Creative Problem Solving Institute on the recommendation of the first creative thinking consultant I ever met, Bob Eberly, he created a system that's used probably daily around the world still, and most people don't know his name. It's called Scamper. It's an acronym of 7 words. All the words are verbs. He created it in order to teach children to become creative again. Because one of the greatest things Torrance did was he did studies over years that resulted in what he called the 4th grade slump. By the 4th grade, anywhere in the world, most children no longer are as creative as they were when they were 5. Now, my system, one example. I worked with different companies doing anywhere from an hour keynote for one of their meetings to a half-day breakout session to a full-day training program. Kimberly Clark, I did a series of 3-day programs in the Atlanta area. But sadly, I would not see examples 6 months later of them using any of it. Well, over my 40 years with SIPSI, mostly as a presenter and a co-leader with some of the programs, I was discovering many examples of companies, I won't use their name because I don't want to be sued, that they might pay an Edward de Bono or even a no-name like me a lot of money to come in and train people. But the PA system turns on after the program, and whoever's on the PA says, ladies and gentlemen, the program is over. The consultant is now leaving the premises. Get back to work. That's when the spreading happened. 1, yes, Some people support creative thinking, but do they support it all the time? No. And how do you support it? Poster, campaigns, training programs, books, libraries, creative thinking rooms, and so forth. That was one of the keys. The other 5 letters, I sent an article to you that explains those. You're welcome to share it, or if people will write to me, I will share the chapter from one of my books that explains what spreading means. And just real quick, P is to, you support it, you promote it, you recognize it and reward it, you apply it, and develop it. They're all action words, but you can do each of those in dozens to hundreds of ways. What I've never seen is a company go beyond just doing an innovation fair or a creativity weekend. No follow through, or what I also call follow on. And then they wonder why their company isn't as creative. Because I've interviewed hundreds, if not thousands over the years, people working in these companies that were published in all the leading magazines as being promoting creativity. It's funny, that factory worker didn't know anything about that. That truck driver didn't know anything about it. And then one of the most famous inventors for one of the big companies, he told me, my managers were against me all 13 years I fought for that product. And we all use that product around the world now.
For people just listening up, Dr. Black is
Art
holding
Fry
up a post-it note.
with his company. I
Absolutely.
interviewed him twice, once in 2002 and then 2006, when he was my introducer to a meeting. And I didn't know he was going to be. He's the one that picked me up. And I knew him already, but we weren't friends, so to speak. But he was really easy to talk to about the history of how these things happen.
Dr. Black, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you today. If people want to find out more about you and your work and your frameworks, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
Okay, I have a series of websites. Unfortunately, I've ended up with a lot of technical corruptions, so I wouldn't recommend that yet. What I would recommend is the following. Type my name into any search engine, Robert Allen Black, and you'll get, actually, and I'm not bragging, it's real, anywhere from 200 million to 400 million hits. Are they all me? No, but the majority of the first 1,000 or so are. Apparently I did the right things back when I didn't know what I was doing when the web was created. I'm reconnected with hundreds of websites around the world that were created then. And because of that, Google and Bing and Yahoo even can find all examples. But if you just type, say, my name, articles, that'll narrow it down. Or my name and spreading, or my company name, creating, CRE8NG.com.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get those links down in the description below. Dr. Black, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they're backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.